Welcome. Thank you all for being here today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jenny Molberg, Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing and Director of the Creative Writing Program here at UCM. Yay, go Mules and Jennies. Creative Mules and Jennies. I am very excited for this afternoon's event, which is sponsored by the School of English and Philosophy and the National Book Foundation. Epics of Memory, today's reading and conversation, will feature two National Book Award honored authors, Victoria Chang, author of OBIT, a groundbreaking collection that confronts grief through reinventions of the newspaper obituary, and Min Jin Lee, who has ties to UCM, and I'm sure she'll tell us a bit more about that later. And Min Jin Lee is the author of the novel PACHINKO, an epic family story that has captivated audiences around the world, and was also recently made into an Apple TV series, so you should check it out. The conversation will be moderated by Kansas City's own Anne Kniggendorf, author of Secret Kansas City and KCUR contributor. 3 years ago, before we were struck down by the pandemic, I had the fortuitous experience of sitting next to the former director of the National Book Foundation on a plane. I was reading Ilya Kaminsky's beautiful book, Deaf Republic, and I noticed this person next to me sort of like reading over my shoulder. And she finally said, "I love that book." And I said, "Me too. You know, every time it comes to an end, I keep starting it over again." So we got to talking about the National Book Foundation and their excellent programming. And by the end of the conversation, we'd arranged to bring National Book Foundation authors to the UCM campus. This is a once-in-a-lifetime event, and I was ecstatic when I found out we were lucky enough to host Min and Victoria, two writers whom I have long admired. I want to give a special thank you to Natalie Green and Taylor Michael at the National Book Foundation for working tirelessly to organize this event. I also want to thank the chair of the chair of the School of English and Philosophy, Mark Joseph, and our fabulous office professional, Patrice Harris, for working so hard to coordinate and help us bring this conversation to life. One really special part of this event is that the National Book Foundation generously donated copies of PACHINKO and OBIT so that all of our students could have a complimentary copy. We've all been reading the books and are very excited to hear them and get to speak with them today. We're grateful for this opportunity. Please join us after the event in the art gallery. We're going to have a reception and everyone is welcome. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Natalie Green of the National Book Foundation, who will kick off the event. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I'll try not to bore you too much before we get to the exciting part. If you want, feel free to move up and we can sort of have an intimate kumbaya moment. I know it's a big theater, but we're so excited to be both together in person, and for those of you tuning in online, thank you all for being here. I want to give a special thanks not only to the University of Central Missouri, but also to Jenny Molberg and a Chance Plain Meeting for her time in helping bring this event to fruition for over 2 years now, and to Mark Joseph and Patrice Harris for making sure that every detail was seen through so beautifully. Thanks too to Clint Braun, Steve Price, Brad Zimmerman, and Chase Castor for helping us look and sound beautiful. We're so happy to be in Warrensburg to celebrate National Book Award honored authors and their work. Some of you might know the National Book Foundation as the presenter of the National Book Awards, which has honored the best literature in America since 1950. Through the support of readers like you, our wonderful partners, and the Mellon Foundation, we work year-round to reach readers everywhere through our education and public programming, online and in person in 42 states and counting. If you're interested in learning more about what we're up to and supporting our work, please visit our website at nationalbook.org, and I also left an e-newsletter sign-up on the table outside the doors. Today we're gathered for a conversation on writing across and through intergenerational memory, family, and place with National Book Award honored authors Victoria Chang and Min Jin Lee, moderated by Anne Kniggendorf. The authors will read from and chat about their work, and then we'll open up at the end to a few audience questions. We have a microphone, which isn't quite center, but right there. That will be for the audience Q&A piece. So just go ahead and file up to that microphone, and we'll get through as many questions as we're able to towards the end. Following the event, the authors will move over to the signing area, also at one of the tables directly outside of the doors you entered in. So make sure to stay around for book signings and then join us in the art gallery like Jenny mentioned for a reception. Thanks to the University of Central Missouri Campus Store for handling those sales. And now I'm delighted to introduce our authors. Victoria Chang's new book of poetry is The Trees Witness Everything. She is the author of the nonfiction book, Dear Memory, and poetry collection, OBIT, a New York Times notable book and a Time must-read book. OBIT received the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, the Anisfield Wolf Book Award in Poetry, and the PEN Volcker Award, and was longlisted for a National Book Award and named a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Griffin International Poetry Prize. She has received a Guggenheim Fellowship and lives in Los Angeles and is a core faculty member within Antioch University's low-res MFA program. Min Jin Lee is the author of the novels Free Food for Millionaires and Pachinko, which was a finalist for the National Book Award and a runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Her writing has been featured in The New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, One Story, the New York Times Book Review, and the Wall Street Journal. She is the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study at Harvard University, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. In 2019, she was inducted into the New York Foundation for the Arts Hall of Fame. She is at work on her third novel, American Hagwon, and a nonfiction work, Name Recognition. And our moderator, Anne Kniggendorf, is a staff writer and editor for the Kansas City Public Library and the author of Secret Kansas City and Kansas City Scavenger. She is a regular contributor to KCUR 89.3 and produces LitHub's fiction, nonfiction podcast. Her work has appeared on NPR, in the Smithsonian Magazine, Publishers Weekly, the Saturday Evening Post, and numerous literary journals and book reviews. And now I'll give it away to them. Enjoy the program.
Hello, thank you for coming and for that lovely introduction. I'd like to invite each of these writers to do a little bit of reading, please. Victoria, would you go first?
Sure. Hello, thanks for coming. Thank you so much for anyone who had a hand in organizing this. It's such a pleasure to be here. And thanks, Jenny, thanks, Natalie, thanks, the university, and it's great to be here with you, and thank you so much, Anne. I'll just read a few poems from this book, OBIT. And there's really not much you need to know about it at all, except that my mother passed away of pulmonary fibrosis. Wow, it's 2015. And it's a disease that's pretty terrible, which we were talking about, and when your lungs sort of harden and you suffocate to death. And so it's not necessarily a quick passing. And so I wrote a bunch of poems, not until much later, though, after she passed, because I didn't want to write any sort of traditional elegies. And so these are poems that are shaped like obituaries. My mother's teeth died twice. Once in 1965, all pulled out from gum disease. Once again on August 3rd, 2015. The fake teeth sit in a box in the garage. When she died, I touched them, smelled them, thought I heard a whimper. I shoved the teeth into my mouth, but having two sets of teeth only made me hungrier. When my mother died, I saw myself in the mirror, her words around my mouth like powder from a donut. Her last words were in English. She asked for Sprite. I wonder whether her last thought was in Chinese. I wonder what her last thought was. I used to think that a dead person's words die with them. Now I know that they scatter, looking for meaning to attach to, like a scent. My mother used to collect orange blossoms in a small, shallow bowl. I passed the tree each spring. I always knew that grief was something I could smell, but I didn't know that it's not actually a noun, but a verb, that it moves. This one is called Grief. Grief as I knew it died many times. It died trying to reunite with other, lesser deaths. Each morning, I lay out my children's clothing to cover their grief. The grief remains but is changed by what it is covered with. A picture of oblivion is not the same as oblivion. My grief is not the same as my pain. My mother was a mathematician, so I tried to calculate my grief. My father was an engineer, so I tried to build a box around my grief, along with a small wooden bed that grief could lie down on. The text kept interrupting my grief, forcing me to speak about nothing. If you cut out a rectangle of a perfectly blue sky, no clouds, no wind, no birds, frame it with a blue frame, place it face up on the floor of an empty museum with an open atrium to the sky. That is grief. And I'll just read two more. Blame. Blame wants to die, but cannot. Its hair is untidy, but it's always here. My mother blamed my father. I blamed my father's dementia. My father blamed my mother's lack of exercise. My father is the story, not the storyteller. I eventually blamed my father because the story kept on trying to become the storyteller. Blame has no face. I have walked on its staircase around and around, trying to slap its face, but only hitting my own cheeks. When some people suffer, they want to tell everyone about their suffering. When the brush hits a knot, the child cries out loud, makes a noise that is an expression of pain, but not the pain itself. I can't feel the child's pain, but some echo of her pain based on my imagination. Blame is just an echo of pain, a veil across the face of the one you blame. I blame God. I want to complain to the boss of God about God. What if the boss of God is rain, and the only way to speak to rain is to open your mouth to the sky and drown? And this is the last one I'll read, and it references the Marjorie Stoneman shooting in Florida. And this is the only poem in the book that was a prompt that someone else had asked me to write, and it was Terrain.org, which is a literary journal that they have this great epistolary series called Dear America. So I wrote a poem for them. America died on February 14, 2018, and my dead mother doesn't know. Since her death, America has died a series of small deaths, each one less precise than the next. My tears are now shaped like hooks, but my heart is damp still. If it is lucky, it is in the middle of its beats. The unlucky dead children hold telegrams they must hand to a woman at a desk. The woman will collect their belongings in shadows. My dead mother asks each of these children if they know me, have seen me, how tall my children are now. They will tell her that they once lived in Florida, not California. She will see the child with a hole in his head. She will blow the dreams out of the hole like dust. I used to think that death was a kind of anesthesia. Now I imagine long lines, my mother taking in all the children. I imagine her touching their hair, how she might tickle their knees to make them laugh. The dead hold the other half of our ticket. The dead are an image of wind. And when they comb their hair, our trees rustle. Thank you.
It's really good to be here. Can you hear me? Is that okay? Super. I wanted to come here today because my uncle is a graduate of UCM, class of 1962. And I learned that this building was here at the time, which means that he might have actually sat in this auditorium. He passed away during the pandemic. So I feel really moved, especially by listening to Victoria's poems about grief, because I've been feeling it for the past 24 hours. I'm going to read a very, very tiny, tiny part of Pachinko. It's about 3 minutes long. And it's when Youngjin, the mother character, says goodbye to her daughter. It's March of 1933. We're at the Busan ferry terminal, where Youngjin is saying goodbye to her pregnant daughter, Sanja. She's about to leave for Japan, and her husband, Ishak. There's really only two things that you should know, is that they're at this terminal and that there's two people and they're saying goodbye. And I thought about this reading for today because I wondered how Uncle John got here and who said goodbye to him. I saw the gold watch in your things, Youngjin said. Was it from that man? Yes. What kind of man can afford something like that? Sanja didn't reply. Where is the man who gave you this watch? He lives in Osaka. But that's where you're going. Are you planning to see him? No. You cannot see this man, Sanja. He abandoned you. He's not good. And Youngjin took her daughter's hand. You cannot see him. That man, Youngjin pointed at Ishak, who was still talking to the immigration officers. That man saved your life. He saved your child. You're a member of his family now. You have no right to see him. And I have no right to see you again. Do you know what it's like for a mother? Soon, you'll be a mother. And I hope you'll have a son who won't have to leave you when he marries. And Sanja nodded. The watch. What will you do with it? I'll sell it when I get to Osaka. And Youngjin was satisfied with that answer. Save it for an emergency. And if your husband asks where you got it, tell him that I gave it to you. And Youngjin fumbled with the purse tucked beneath her blouse. This belonged to your father's mother. And Youngjin gave her the 2 gold rings that her mother-in-law had given to her before she died. Try not to sell these unless you have to. You should have something in case you need money. You're a thrifty girl, but raising a child requires money. There will be things that you can't expect, like doctor visits. And if it's a boy, you'll need money for school. And if your husband doesn't give you money for the household, earn something and put aside savings for emergencies. Spend what you need, but just throw even a few coins into a tin and forget that you have it. A woman should always have something set by. Take good care of your husband. Otherwise, another woman will. And treat your husband's family with reverence. Obey them. And if you make mistakes, they will curse our family. Think of your kind father, who always did his best for us. And Youngjin tried to think of anything else that she was supposed to tell her daughter. But it was so hard to focus. And Sanja slipped the rings into the fabric bag beneath her blouse, where she kept her watch and money. Amini, I'm sorry. I know. And Youngjin closed her mouth and she stroked Sanja's hair. You're all I have. And now, I have nothing. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm thinking about the topic of our discussion tonight, how intergenerational memory, family, and place shape your work. It's really the intergenerational part that I'd like to look at. PACHINKO and OBIT are both very much projects that bear out the notion that everything in our lives in one way or another is shaped by those who come before us. So before we get going, would you mind each describing the projects of your books for those who haven't read them? I understand that most people here in the auditorium have read them, but people at home may not have. Victoria?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like when you're writing poetry or when one can be writing poetry, I think everyone is different. It's hard to know where the poems are coming from. And, even though this appears like it's, the idea came early on, I think for me, it just came one word at a time, one word in front of the next, much like grief felt to me. And I resisted the notion of writing traditional elegies for so long because I didn't feel like I could write a better poem, than the elegies that had already been written. And also I think you have to be ready to sort of write about things that are really deep inside of you. And so one day I just heard on NPR, they were talking about a documentary on OBIT. It was on obituary writers, and just something about that word, and I've said this in so many interviews, like that word of the long O and that hard T at the end, something triggered, and I just went home and I wrote a ton of these little obituaries for everything that had died, and so that's sort of how my book came about.
Is this working? Sorry. I also want to thank Anne for moderating us because writers need to be corralled. So thank you, Anne. And I got the idea for the book when I was 19, when I was in college. So I went to a lecture and I heard a guest talk about the Korean-Japanese. And it was a white missionary, do-gooder type person who went to Japan, and he served the Korean-Japanese population, and he told a story about a 13-year-old boy who had climbed up to his apartment building and he killed himself by jumping off of it. And he was Korean, but he was born in Japan, and his parents, also Korean, were born in Japan. And when they went through his things, they found his middle school yearbook. And in his middle school yearbook, they had written, "I hate you, you smell like kimchi," and they wrote the words, "die, die, die." And I heard that story when I was 19 years old, and it kind of burned into my brain. And for those of you who know, I fight against anti-Asian violence in this country. I do everything I can to speak out about it. So I guess I can say that I've been thinking a great deal about anti-Asian racism for a very long time, and my work really embodies that ethos.
Okay, so these projects are really, really different. But what's similarly striking in each was this sense that our lives are shaped by our ancestors in ways that we can't control, and yet all the time we still exercise free will. But then our free will shape the lives of our descendants, right? So I think it would be way too much to get into to talk about what determines the fate of an individual here tonight, so we won't try for that. But just thinking of the families portrayed in each of your books, how did you approach this idea of some paths being determined for us and others being accessible by choice? Min, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I think that's kind of like teed up for me in many ways. I feel so weird being here. Like, I feel really moved by being here, primarily because I get invitations, but I was so surprised to get this invitation from this university because my uncle went here, and of all the colleges he could have gone to, he went here. And the fact that I'm in this building, it feels so destined. And then, of course, I'm a Presbyterian, which means that I believe in this weird thing called predestination. So this idea of fate and free will is something that I think about constantly, and it's really reflected in all of my work.
That's so beautiful. And we were talking before this event started that my parents also came here in the 60s, I would say, so right around the same time from Taiwan. And my mother's originally from mainland China, so she left the war there and went to Taiwan, and then left another country, which I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine leaving my state sometimes of California, and I feel so homesick for my state and my city. And to think that my mother left two countries and how trauma may have been really sort of built into or baked into my childhood and be in my own DNA. So, and to answer your question, I really think that my mother was a huge believer in fate. So she used to, everything was fate. You know, it's like if something bad happened to you, well, that was your fate. If something good happened to you, that was your fate. And I think when we were each born, she went to like a fortune teller. And for the rest of my life and her life, she would say, oh, that was your fate. And so, I think determinism, and yet we're in this country where it's all about free will, right? It's all about self-determination, and you can do that, or you can fix that. We live in a super fix-it culture, and so those things were always pressing against each other while I was growing up.
There's so much also about representation in each of your books that really caught my attention. So a major theme that you're each grappling with is the idea of one thing's ability to represent another. So Victoria, in yours, you mention a lot of forms of representation, right? You have like X-ray as form of representation, memories as representation. You write that when we die, we're represented by representations of representations, like it's just stacked on top of each other. You have a mother as representation of home, and the whole book even is a representation of a life, and so on. But the thing that you say has no simile at all, that's not a representation, and nothing else can really represent it, is death. I realize that's pretty abstract, but maybe you can make that a little more concrete about how you arrived at death simply being death among all these other things that function as representations. I mean, that's kind of a wild question, but really that's the project of your book is death.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think when my mother passed, and I felt like I became a card-carrying member of a mother passing, and it's truly an awful card to carry. And then when my father passed away this January, after a long illness, he had a stroke 15 years ago now. I feel like then you become a card-carrying member of the orphan, right? And it just, these are really awful experiences to live through. But then you also grow a lot from those experiences. And for me, I really grew up fast when my dad had a stroke. And so I think that when my mother died, I was thinking this is an impossible emotion to describe. It's just not possible. But when I'm given sort of that impossible task, I want to try and describe it. And so the book really became this relentless and unforgiving and persistent, determined, I think, exploration of trying to describe grief in language, which is naturally an exercise of slippage. It's impossible to describe just about everything. And so, I think it's a failure in the end, because I don't think
the book is a failure?
Yeah, I don't think you can describe grief. I think it's just something impossible. But I think the beautiful thing about art and language is that we try. So we try and make art to describe something that's we all feel, to connect each other with each other, but it ultimately is very difficult. So that would be how I answer.
Yeah, so like if death had been able to represent something, or something could represent death, would that have made your project easier?
Well, the project probably wouldn't exist, right?
I don't know. I guess grief and death I mean, they're so intertwined, but grief takes another person, I guess, to, yeah.
I mean, grief is here forever, but death is sort of, I feel like death is somewhere else. It's not here, yeah.
What do you mean by that?
I just think that grief stays with the living. Grief is an emotion that the living must now navigate through. But death is something that we will each experience, but it's impossible for us to know what that is until we're right there. So I think it's not meant to be understood, and any exercise in trying to understand death is a useless one. But I think grief, that's an emotion that we all feel collectively during the pandemic, individually, you know, when a pet dies, all throughout our days we experience it in different ways. So that's, I think, what I was trying to explore more than death itself.
Okay, thank you. And Min, your representations in Pachinko are really much more contained to humans, and that feels like the kind of the concrete world. More than once, you have the idea that one bad member of a group can hurt not just the whole family or the entire nation, but a whole ethnicity. And that comes up repeatedly. So just looking at the half-brothers, Noah and Mozasu, they're representatives, right? So on the one hand, the older brother Noah grows up to make a perfect nuclear family of his wife and 3 kids, but he's the product of an affair, so he's the product of a broken family, and he's so horrified by what he represents that he wants to disappear. But then on the other hand, the family, his legitimate half-brother, legitimate in quotation marks, Mozasu creates a cobbled-together family, and his wife has died, and the woman who becomes his common-law wife steps out of a complicated family situation to mother his son. But you write that family is organically attached to one seamless body, which I thought was so interesting because it's the opposite of his brothers. This is getting really complicated, so I hope you're following me at least. But each brother's representing a lineage and an ethnicity, and in really different ways. So there's a lot of tension in these ideas, and I started wondering how you used representation as kind of an engine to make the story go.
Well, I love your question, and I like the way your mind thinks. So I really appreciate your thoughtfulness in this, because I spent almost 3 decades of my life with this book. So of course, every character, every word is so important to me, because by the time it got to my reader, it's the 80th version. So every character is meant to represent something. And very often, I'm asked the question as a writing teacher, what is cultural appropriation? When is representation wrong? When can I do this? When can I do that? And I always kind of think, you can write about anything you want to write about, but just be fair. And know this, is that if you have only one member of a group as a minority within another group, I want you to know that that person will end up embodying everybody in that group. So you have a responsibility. So in this family, you have these brothers, and they represent different things. But one of the things that I wanted to say is that every single person who is a male in Pachinko represents a certain kind of philosophy too. So we have this idea of family, but we also, in this large family, right this moment of every single person in this room, if we were connected biologically or logically, what would you embody? So you might have, let's say, Moses, who is somebody who didn't do very well in school, but he's a very savvy and canny business person. So his idea of becoming a man has to do with making money. If I can make money and if I can be a decent person, then that's my kind of masculinity. And you have Noah, his idea of masculinity is to be the perfect Japanese man. And in his mind, he has this idea that he's got to be good at school, he's got to be good at sports, and he has to be liked by the majority. And of course, that becomes completely destroyed when he learns that he is, in fact, connected to somebody who is not a good person in a technical sense, and certainly not a respectable person because he's a gangster. And then it ends up destroying him. So every character does represent an idea, because for me, I write books about ideas. Very often you'll find prose writers who are moved by feeling or an image, and that's really great. That's just not me. So I always start out with an idea and an argument, and then I try to figure out, well, how do I make this into a moving story? And it's really hard for me. So I end up taking a really long time.
Well, it creates a lot of tension, so that was really great, and that's why I started thinking of that in itself as a way that you've moved the story, is just with that tension alone almost. That's
Thank you.
pretty spectacular.
Thank you.
And so, we have to keep coming back to death, I'm afraid. Very sorry about that. But in each of your books, there's a lot about a death wish. And so I wondered if you could each talk about what it means to wish for death in your projects.
Yeah, I think poets have, we joke about thinking about death at a super young age. I can't think of when I didn't think about death as a person. And I think I started thinking about death when I was really little. And so for me, there's not a kind of taboo to thinking about death or talking about death or joking about death. And I do know that in this book, even I die, like Victoria Chang dies, I don't know how many times, but many times. And then when they were making the cover of this book, they put my picture on there, which really actually freaked me out for someone who's supposedly not afraid of death. But it actually did scare me a little bit because I'm also really superstitious, just like my mother was. But then I thought, who cares? We all, like if it's going back to my mother's comment, it's like, if it was your fate to die at this moment because the light falls on my head, then so be it. That is what it is. And hopefully I've lived a good life before that. And so, yeah, I think confronting it was a way of subverting it, or having agency over it and not living within the fear of it. So, yeah, that's all I have to say.
How do death wishes play into Pachinko?
It's very funny you asked that question because when I was about 16, I learned that I had this really horrible blood disease, and I'm fine now, but it carried out and where I had liver cirrhosis and I had to have interferon B and I lost my hair and all these things. But for decades, I had this horrible liver disease and I was carrying it and I can give it to other people. I was hepatitis B chronic carrier. Anyway, so I learned this when I was 16. And when I was in college, it became active instead of inactive. And I became very ill. And this very famous doctor at Yale New Haven Hospital said that you're going to die in your 20s and 30s and you'll probably get cancer. And then it ended up that he was right. I got liver cirrhosis in my 30s, and then everything's okay because of technology. However, because I've had this sort of death sentence as a very young person, I always thought, I wasn't worried. It was more like, I have very little time, which means that I have less time than the next person, which means I got to get all this stuff done. So I've always felt like I had this race against time. But it didn't make me feel gloomy. It made me feel like, this really matters. Like this moment matters so intensely. And it's in every single word in Pachinko. I have felt the sense of meaning of my life. And just this afternoon, I was at the library at UCM with two librarians who are here today, Sarah and Maya, and we were going through the archives of what the school looked like in the 60s because I wanted to see what what he saw when he was here in the 60s. And in my mind, I saw this vibrant young person from a foreign country walking across the quad. And I saw him going to the student union. I saw the tables where he sat. I saw the coffee that he would drink, what necktie he might want to wear because he probably couldn't afford it. And then it made me feel like our vitality matters so much. So and the fact that here we have, essentially strangers looking for this person and caring enough to look for it. And that's when I think I feel deep grief. I feel a sense of lament. And yet I also feel this vitality of our lives having mattered. So I kind of think that's what writers were always playing with. that sense of vitality, as well as the lament that where did the vitality go and when can we control it?
Well, we'll just do one more question and take questions from the audience. But there's this passage really right in the middle of Pachinko that I think speaks to both of your books so nicely. And I imagine this is why Pachinko is called Pachinko, from this passage. That's how it is in my imagination anyway. But it's the younger brother, Mozasu. He's the pachinko parlor millionaire, and he's just reflecting here. And you write, his Presbyterian minister father had believed in a divine design, and Mozasu believed that life was like this game where the player could adjust the dials, yet also expect the uncertainty of factors he couldn't control. He understood why his customers wanted to play something that looked fixed, but which also left room for randomness and hope. So, Min, what did you have in mind there, and how much were you playing with the idea of hope really throughout Pachinko?
Well, you obviously get an A+ in the exam because you got the thesis.
Thank you.
Well done, well done. So if anybody has to write a paper on Pachinko, there you go. Just
Toward
like that
the middle,
section.
a little to the right.
I think for me, I find life hard. I find really life hard because I feel things all the time, and it overwhelms me. And I think if I didn't feel a sense of love and hope and possibility, because I'm so conscious of the fact that there's so much evil. Like, I really believe that evil exists, but I also really believe that goodness exists. And when I think about right now of how Putin will not relent in Ukraine, when I think about how we don't care about Yemen and Darfur and Sudan and so many other things, I think, well, what am I complicit in? So how will I avoid despair? And I teach students, and I'm always trying to say, I know all this is here. This is absolutely shit show. And yet, I need you to feel hope and to believe that even if you take a tiny bit of action, that it matters. So I had to put love and hope in the book because I couldn't possibly read a book just about the evil of colonialism.
Thank you for not writing a book just about the evils of colonialism. And Victoria, in your book, it seems there are these times when hope is lost, like when you realize that pulmonary fibrosis can be slowed down but not cured, and that was the death of hope in your book. But there is still room for randomness and hope also. So how did you weave that into this story that it seemed so hopeless?
Yeah, I mean, and I love what you were saying about teaching your students and talking to students and about having hope. Ultimately, I think even if you're writing about death because you have hope, and you're looking for hope, and you're trying to find it. It's all there, and I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think death and hope are intertwined, just as joy and sadness are intertwined. For me, like, once I had some children, that changed everything in that I started, like many of us were, or not many, but some of us are helping people die or we're helping grow people. And so I think that forces you to be hopeful because you're raising the next generation and you're teaching them all of the values that Min was talking about. Is you must not let this planet die. This is you try not to put so much burden on them, but you do teach them how to have hope and how to take action and what the difference is between right and wrong, and all the things that Min was talking about. So I think for me, it's ever present in this book, which are the little mini tankas that are sprinkled throughout, which are written to children and the next generation.
Thank you both very much, and we'd like to open it up for questions now. I think there's a microphone that you can step up to. Yeah, there in the aisle.
I'm probably one of the few extroverts among us. Hello.
I'm one.
Oh, wonderful. I don't want to stand too close to the mic. Anyway, My name is Emma Fisher. I'm the news editor for our student newspaper, also an aspiring novelist. And you were talking about fate and death, and that's, I think, really kind of ironic because someone in my family just died in December. So I've been really relating, tearing up here in the back. But we're going to talk about the more technical side of writing. My question, at least, is about that. So this is kind of for both of you. What do you feel like was the most important step you took in the process of getting published?
Emma, yes? I'm so sorry for your loss. I think the most important step about getting published was that I was able to keep sending things out in the face of relentless rejection. And I also was willing to take classes and read my masters. There are so many amazing writers in the world, and although I never met them, I read them and I felt like I knew them. I also took classes in every genre. So I took it in fiction, nonfiction, and I even took prosody classes because I wanted to understand how a sentence worked. And by the time I sent my work out at a certain point, I felt like, if you deny me, that's not on me. So I do think that craft, as well as the wish to tell the story that only you could tell, that only Emma could tell, is something that I really encourage you to do. So when I teach classes, I always say, I can't teach you how to write a novel in a semester. That's impossible. It's a vanity and it's a fool's errand. However, I can encourage you to tell the story that only Emma can say, because no one else can do it except you. And if I could somehow bring you to that point where you feel like you have the courage to even try, then I feel like I've succeeded as a teacher.
Yeah, that was so beautifully said. I mean, I don't really have anything to add, but maybe I'll just say that I think it's important to have both humility, which is a part of the learning. Like, there's so much that we don't know, but then also to have vision and conviction. And so, in the face of rejection, which is a lot, I mean, there are lots of different faces of rejection, but it does come at you constantly. I think it's important to keep learning, but then to also have conviction about what you can do or what you're writing. And sometimes you're not aligned with what the world wants. It's fine. You know, you just keep writing what you want to write and just keep working harder at doing that.
Hi, my name is Jang, and I'm a poet and a mom, and I'm also an emotional. I have two questions, but I'll just ask one right now, and that's, we touched a little bit about it when talking about hope, I think, because I think hope is talking towards the present and the future, and I mean, this is about epics of memory, but I'm thinking too about, you know, we talk about intergenerational trauma and resilience, and we often think of it backwards, right? But I wondered about how you see it, whether it's in your work or just in general, this sense of what's happening as we move forward for ourselves and also for future generations.
Was the question the role of memory in our work? Is that right, Haejang? I'm not sure.
I guess it's...
Forgive me.
No. I'm emotional and unclear. So...
No, you're not emotionally unclear. You're clear to have your emotions, yes.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, and it kind of, yes, memory to some extent, but what is future memory, I suppose, might be a way to think about it. But also just how do we take what we, learn from our lives, our writing and spaces into the future?
I have a very quick answer for Haejang. It's Haejang, yes?
Yes.
It's for Haejang. My therapist said that the most important thing that I can do is remember. Mm-hmm. And he's a really brilliant human being. And the more I think about this idea of remembering, the more I realize how important it is about being human. Because as you get older and as you become more adult, we're forced to say, that's not important, forget it. But I think for a writer, it is so incredibly important, and also for all of us to remember and to actually take the time and process that memory. And as for future memory, which I really think is a very smart question, I don't like the way things are today. So part of my work is to imagine a new future, right? Which requires making future memory. So thank you for your question.
Thank you for your answer on time. And also, my regrets for your losses as well.
Do you have anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I could, but then I don't feel like anything's coming. So
Okay,
I'll leave
sure,
it
don't
with
force it.
Min's beautiful answer.
Sure, it looks like we have another one, probably just one more question.
Hi, my name is Gage. I'm a junior and I'm in the English education program, and I plan on teaching high school English. I'm really fascinated by what and who inspires us. I know we talked a lot today about what inspires us, and I noticed that there are two common types of people that authors cite. They cite family members and they cite authors. I know your books include quotations for both Dickens and Shakespeare, but what I want to know specifically is if you had English teachers or teachers in your life that had a specific moment or something that inspired you, either as a person or with your career in writing.
Victoria?
That's a great question. Congratulations. I'm so glad that you want to be a high school teacher. And when you were talking, all these people flashed in my head. And I went to a public school in Michigan, in the small town of West Bloomfield, Michigan. And it was a huge school, and I was entirely invisible. But that invisibility allowed me to sit in the back of these English rooms and learn from this woman named Mrs. Lineweber, who made us read all of this Dickinson and memorize poems all the time, and then write our own poems. And and when I was in high school, I had written some poems about self-harm and suicide, and she called me up to the classroom and talked to me about it, and I'll never forget that. And then I had another fiction teacher, Mr. Corcoran, who had us reading short stories and all the Hemingways, and he stood up in the front of the classroom and basically just read us entire novels. So it really worked for those of us. I'm more of a visual learner, but he was way ahead of his time, because I'm sure there are people in there that were more auditory, and it was like going to his class and having story time. So I will never forget these teachers. They changed my life, because I didn't have English-speaking parents, and they didn't read any American or English or any sort of Western language sort of literature. So they are absolutely responsible for making me a writer today.
Awesome, thank you.
I write about my English teachers. So if you look at my essays, you will see people name-checked. And then the funny thing is, they have found me. Like, I had not intended to have them know, in a way. Of course I wanted to, and they're very nice evocations, because I'm so impressed by what they did in my life. But Mr. Green, Mr. Martin Green, Mrs. Vera Zelaznik, Mr. Richard Sosis. So, you see, in my mind, they still have the Mr. attached to their names. They're not regular people anymore. And I think that their passion and their sincerity meant so much to me. And I was recently asked to introduce the Penguin Classics for The Great Gatsby. And because of my beautiful, brilliant English teachers, I wanted to do this kind of job that would still get me a really good grade. It was kind of funny. So in Penguin Classics, when they ask an author to introduce a work, you're supposed to kind of cough one up for not much time, more like an impressionistic, emotional kind of thing. But I ended up spending 3 months of my life working on a 6,000-word essay with 100 footnotes, because there were arguments that I wanted to make about Gatsby and how it had affected me. And as a writer and also as a student. And I did it primarily as a tribute to my English teachers in high school. So
Has that been published?
Yeah, it is actually published.
So we can find that now?
Yeah, it's a Penguin Classics. You can find it.
Thank you so much.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you all for your thoughtful questions and for being here with us tonight. And thank you again, Victoria and Min, for joining us here at UCM.
Thank you, Anne.